speakers for this debate. They are Benjamin Leong, who is the panel chair for today's debate. We also have Sherilyn Wee, Adrian Tan, Na She Mei, Yang Meng Ying, Andrew Xiao, and Lee Ka Hong. The motion for this debate reads, this House believes that government should fund fertility treatment for couples. On side proposition, we have Victoria Junior College. Their first speaker is Goh Jun Wei. Their second speaker is Sarah Tay. Their third speaker is Victoria Seong. Sarah Tay will also be delivering a reply speech. On side opposition, we have Anglo-Chinese Junior College. Their first speaker is Aloysius Chan. Their second speaker is Samuel Whitberger. Their third speaker is Annette Yeo. Samuel Whitberger will also be delivering a reply speech. Without further ado, may I invite the first speaker of the proposition to open their team's case.
Ladies and gentlemen, imagine that you are actually... I'm sorry, 1 second. I apologize. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine that you are actually a woman that is unable to conceive, a woman that is being told by the government that you cannot conceive because you do not have $10,000. This is the injustice, the unfairness within society today that side proposition wants and wishes to correct. Ladies and gentlemen, on side proposition, we stand for the full funding of fertility treatments upon the acceptance of an application by an individual. Now, before I move on to my case proper, I have a few key characterizations to make. Firstly, now we characterize governments as governments within DCs, for example, such as governments of Japan, governments of Singapore, and we characterize the context, right, in the manner whereby countries and places whereby fertility treatments are actually available. We are talking about DCs such as Japan and Singapore, for example. And we are also talking about countries whereby, they are actually falling birth rates. For example, Japan, with the world's third lowest birth rates. Now, we also think that the government has an incentive to resolve and ensure the growth of the country and its demographics. So, onto the characterization of fertility treatments, right? So, we think that fertility treatments in this situation actually includes, IVF, surrogacy, etc. And on side proposition, we want to allow women who are infertile to actually now have their own children. And this actually, we would like to point out, differs very much from other avenues such as, adoptions, etc. Whereby, because the kids are actually genetically their own. And we believe that society recognizes the benefit of having a genetic lineage. So, that brings me to my case proper. I have two substances for today. Firstly, on why the government has the duty to take action. And secondly, as to how funding fertility treatments is beneficial to stakeholders. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in today's debate, for the first substantive, I have two tiers. On the first tier, I will discuss how the state has the duty to protect individual rights. So, I would like to point out that the ability to conceive, the ability to give birth, the ability to give birth, the ability to continue genetic lineage is a very fundamental right of any human being. We say that humans are very nurturing beings that actually respect reproductive rights, beings that understand that reproductive rights are something in society that is important and should be protected. Now, we believe that in status quo is very much unfair, and individuals actually, by mere virtue of birth lottery, actually lack fertility, and we said that should not be propagated within society. And we say today that in the government, right, we say that as protector of individual rights, we should actually allow individuals to actualize these rights and leave a legacy which is a core part of actualization and humanity itself. And we say that we should actually fund fertility treatments to allow women to actualize these rights and fully deserve what everyone else sitting out there has. But before I move on, yes ma'am.
If you're going to fund things like surrogacy and money come from?
That's a very good question. Where does the money come from? We see that today we are already funding different things, such as baby bonus schemes. We are already funding things such as, paid maternity leaves, etc. We are already making these funding, so we don't see why we should not take a step further and go into these arenas. So anyway, now to my second tier. Now we see that there's a need for the government to actually achieve societal goods. And what do I mean by that? We recognize that the government has a vested interest in society and has a vested interest in ensuring the size of the country's population and demographics. We say that a lot of policies today are actually catered towards the population size itself, especially economic policies, for example, whereby we require a regulated workforce for the government to actually plan an economic future and landscape that the country, that society actually wants. And we say the government has the rights today to actually shape these demographics, to ensure that circumstances to enact these economic policies actually exist. And we say, for example, in Singapore, for example, in the late 1900s, we say that we actually had birth control to actually restrict the population size, right? And we actually, to allow for the increase in provision of services to everyone, thus allowing for manageable population and ensuring economic growth. And we see that in today's context, it's very much applicable as well, and it's still pertinent. Why do we say that? We say that Singapore has an incentive for individuals to actually get married and have children due to the declining growth rates, right? And we say that baby bonus, paternity leave, and fertility leave, etc. is already present in status quo. And we say that we actually have to incentivize couples to actually have kids, and states have always had the prerogative to implement policies within their domestic sphere, and therefore we say that funding fertility treatments are within their rights and abilities. And that moves me very nicely to my second substantive as to how funding fertility treatments is very much beneficial to stakeholders. Now, why do I say that? I have two tiers on this, right? Firstly, on the increase in fertility rate allows the ability to conceive. What do I mean by that? Okay, sorry. Basically, right, when you actually fund individuals at a younger age, when you actually fund individuals and allow them to actually have fertility treatments, right, you actually allow them to conceive at a younger age. These are prime age whereby women can actually conceive, allowing them to actually, right? Because we have seen, right, that when they are actually older, they're actually not able to conceive as easily, right? Their chances of conceiving through, IVF, for example, actually decreases. And we say that we need to actually actualize, government needs to provide funding to allow couples actualize the fertility treatments at this younger age. And we need to allow for increase in the chance of having children. Now, on the second tier of this substantive, right, I'm telling you that this actually financially empowers couples to actualize their rights. Now, what do I mean by that? Say, for example, in cases where couples can actually never, ever afford sufficient savings for fertility treatments, which is very costly, $10,000 to $15,000 at a shot, right? We say that even if they cannot afford it, it does not remove their rights to actually have children. Now, why do I say that, right? Because the financial situation today should not preclude them from reproductive rights. And money otherwise devoted, and we say that, if we actually allow for funding, money otherwise devoted towards fertility treatments will now can actually now be spent on the child. And when it can actually be spent on the child, it increases the quality of life of the child itself. And we say that, we do not believe that circumstances of a child's birth should dictate the poverty of the child's life. And we say that our policy actually betters, even though it's not perfect, it betters the status quo, and it allows the child to be better off.
Point of information.
In comparison to opposition paradigm. But before I move on, yes, sir.
The reason why there are low birth rates is not because people can't conceive, but because they don't want to conceive.
Yes, people do not want to conceive, so our policy encourages individuals to actually conceive. Some of them do not want to conceive because they think that it's too expensive, that IVF is too expensive. By actually implementing this policy, we reduce and remove certain barriers and allow individuals to actually conceive. So onto my third tier, right, on social inequality, we say that in opposition paradigm today, they only benefit the upper echelons of society to actually access these treatments, right, but restricts the poor from these financial treatments, these fertility treatments. And we say this is extremely significant because we are talking about lineage and we are talking about the future equality of society itself. We are saying that it's extremely unfair that the rich can have access to these reproductive rights while the poor cannot. This is because their children will actually affect the future of demographics of a particular country, right? But for example, 10 years down the road, you're going to have more rich people being able to conceive more rich children, and the poor cannot actually conceive as many children. And this is why we see there will be a potential increase in inequality in the future. The states have always intervened in society society and has always wanted to achieve some modicum of equity, and therefore we say that they actually have an imperative to step in and ensure that everybody in society are as financially and socially empowered as other individuals. This is why we say that we want women, we want people, we want individuals to be able to actually have the right to conceive. This is why we say we want society to be able to be better off. This is why we should stand with side proposition. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 7 seconds. Next, may I invite the first speaker of the opposition to open their team's case.
Testing. To begin with, the side of proposition never understood what in vitro fertilization and other fertility treatments were actually used for, because they actually needed a medical basis for the person to even pursue fertility treatment in the first place. And that's why normal couples who don't have any biological problems conceiving won't use IVF, because they can simply use the time-tested traditional means of biological conception. And because of that, none of the benefits that they talked about couples somehow having more children as a result of increased access to fertility, was already taken down. Because we need to recognize that the people who actually use fertility treatments fall into an absolute minority of society who have pre-existing medical conditions and thus require this treatment in the first place. Their side never recognized that. We also need to address the mechanism that proposition presented to us, which was, I quote their first speaker very gladly, full funding. Full funding for a whole host of expensive treatments which are prohibitive and for the government to fully sponsor, such as surrogacy, such as hormone therapy, such as genetic screening. All of these consume massive amounts of resources, and all of this never answered the key question. Where does the money come from? They offered a circuitous response, but they never understood how governments operate on the basis of fixed resources. We're forced to assume one of two things. The first is that they're going to raise taxes in order to sponsor these massively expensive fertility programs for all these people, which is detrimental to society because it increases the burden on the individual taxpayer. The second other possible scenario on their side is that they're going to divert funds from other areas of government spending in order to ensure that these fertility programs can fully manifest, which incurs its own host of problems, as I will prove later in my substantive, on the opportunity cost that is incurred on other sectors. Now, with all of that dealt with, moving on to two main points of contention. Firstly, on the duty of the government, and secondly, on the interests of the stakeholders. On the first point of contention, on the duty of government. But before I continue, yes, madam.
Are you saying then that you are never going to fund any kind of population measures just because you do not have the funds?
Madam, we need to understand the type of population measure that is being implemented. We've already proved how your side doesn't impact the majority of society who is going to have children. But even then, we see that other measures of population policy have a large-scale impact as compared to the extremely small, narrow range of benefits that fertility programs incur. That is precisely why your side doesn't have any grounds because of that. Moving back to my point of contention on the duty of government. And here, proposition talked about unfairness and how the government needed to protect individual rights. But we need to recognize that reproduction isn't an absolute right on its own, and in vitro fertilization doesn't fall as an essential right. We see many childless couples who forgo the right to reproduction, leading extremely happy lives, and even in the cases of couples who derive pleasure from having large numbers of children, it's not about their happiness on the scale of things. This is what I will be forwarding in my own later substantive on how in vitro fertilization and other fertility programs aren't an absolute right. I'll flag that out later. But even then, proposition talked about resolving population issues. Never mind that we've already taken that down by telling you how it's not going to solve population issues in the majority. Here's why I'm going to further that logic by telling you about the correlation-causation fallacy that they have committed. As flagged out in our earlier point of information, there are many reasons why people choose not to have children. It's not necessarily the fertility or the availability of fertility treatments, but it's also because of societal issues such as the immense cost of raising the child, the time expenditure that is required. None of this is resolved by proposition's policy, and their side isn't going to solve population problems. Moving on to the second point of contention on the benefits to stakeholders. No thank you. And here's where proposition wanted the people to reproduce at an earlier age. That's not the issue at task in today's debate. It's about funding the fertility issues. Because even at this earlier age, we're not going to see any tangible impact that's reflected at all. They gave us this extremely interesting logic on the poverty of a child's life. Never mind that their policy only applied funding to the fertility treatment itself and not on the downstream impacts, the continued costs of raising the child, especially in the modern society that we live in, where it's extremely expensive. They can't expect the government to fully subsidize the bringing up of the child from infancy to adulthood. It's simply not practical. And then, on the final idea of social inequality, they talked about how it would increase the gap between the rich and the poor. On the first level response, it's not about the absolute number of rich people versus poor people, but rather the gap in income that occurs. Fertility has no bearing on this. On the second point, their side only exacerbates inequality because it allows the poor to have more children, and this forces them to expend more money and entrench themselves in poverty even further. That is why their side is worse for inequality, because the poor get poorer even if their policy is effective. Now transitioning to the stance that we have on side opposition, where we acknowledge the choice of couples to pursue fertility treatment, but we do not believe that it is appropriate for governments to be the ones to channel funding into what is essentially a minority, non-essential issue that undercuts alternatives like adoption and undermines society at large. And to this end, we'll be forwarding 4 key arguments. I, as the first speaker, will be talking about how fertility is not a right, and here's where we clash entirely with the principle that proposition is presenting. And secondly, on the idea of opportunity cost, how their solution is completely unworkable. While my second speaker will continue on uplifting orphans and spurring research and development. Now transitioning to my first constructive argument on how fertility is not a right, the principal clash with proposition. The thesis of this argument is that fertility treatment does not constitute an essential broad-based right, and hence government money should not be allocated to it. At a fundamental level, the government operates based on taxpayer money, where in most cases up to 2/3 of all public funds come from tax revenue. This therefore gives the government the obligation to serve this taxpayer base by spending that money responsibly, that is, in a manner that directly impacts and benefits the majority of society that contributed to this reserve of wealth in the first place. In contrast, fertility treatment is an immensely personal decision for personal benefit that is carried out by a minuscule minority within society. It is a personal responsibility that, given the extremely limited degree of impact, doesn't fall under the category of essential rights and is hence outside of the government's overall purview. In essence, while the government serves to protect you with a basic standard of living in terms of daily survival, in things like education, utilities, and public services, the government does not have the duty to appease a minority of society on the extremely abstract level of happiness. Here's where we draw a parallel to the education system, where the United Kingdom government sponsors basic primary and secondary education because it acknowledges that the majority will benefit and that it is an essential skill. But it doesn't sponsor tertiary education and enrichment programs because these are non-essential and things that the individuals can pursue at their own level. Therefore, fertility treatment is not a basic, far-reaching right that justifies government intervention. On to the final point on the idea of opportunity cost. And here's where we ask them the question again, where is the money going to come from? Because devoting large amounts of public funding for fertility treatments places undue financial strain on governments and in a post-financial crisis world is ultimately detrimental. The premise of this argument is how fertility treatments are prohibitively expensive. $10,000 per cycle of IVF, multiple cycles per patient. And if their side wants a full subsidy, it's only going to be even more expensive than it would otherwise be. We need to recognize the context that governments are presently working under, how the financial crisis has depleted public reserves, and how the government now has to manage its priorities under its purview. Whether they are going to devote spending to ensure maximum benefit for all stakeholders in essential areas like education and healthcare, or if they're going to channel it to an extremely niche area like fertility treatments, which doesn't benefit the majority and compromises on the efficacy of these existing mechanisms. We give you the example of the Greek hospital service, which was forced to divert money from its emergency room services to other niche areas, and because of that, the ambulances stopped running. We believe that fertility is important, but it's not the role of government to carry out full funding for this, because fertility doesn't achieve a more fertile land for all.
Spoke for 8 minutes and 17 seconds. I thank the speaker for his speech. Next, may I invite the second speaker of the proposition to deliver her speech.
Yes. Can everyone hear me? Ladies and gentlemen, the entire crux of side opposition's case today lies on the fact that just because you are a minority, the state has no duty to you. Just because you are a minority, you don't deserve any of the state's attention or you don't deserve any of the state's funds. We think that this is fundamentally problematic simply because the state has always tried to protect minorities, and it's precisely because they have to protect minorities that's why the state intervenes in many issues, right? I think that that's precisely the case here, that we need to empower these people who cannot give birth but want to, and we think that it's their fundamental right they are protected here today. So I have two main points of contention for the House today, right? Firstly, on what is really the prioritization of governments, and secondly, on whose side can better solve the problem. So let's look at the first issue, on what is the prioritization of the governments, right? Because on their side, the first thing they told you is that reproductive rights are not a fundamental right, and that's why the government has no necessity or no incentive to protect them. Really? Is this really true, ladies and gentlemen? This is something that our first speaker has really brought up to you right from the beginning of his substantive right. It was his very first year of his first substantive. Why reproductive rights are a fundamental right. And they've never clashed with this idea. The idea that as human beings, one of our most important roles is as people who nurture others, right? As parents who bring up our children. And we think that the right to even, on a very practical level, continue your family lineage, no thank you, continue your family lineage and continue that kind of genetic heritage that you want, right, is something that is considered to be very important in society as well. And if the state is going to protect these kinds of societal interests and like larger fundamental rights, right, I think the state is imperative to protect this as well. Yes, sir.
If the state does have a right to impose this model on fertility treatments on couples, why do you then address the minority in society which aren't going to benefit in total?
No, we think that the minorities are going to benefit, and I'm going to show you in my substantive later how the majority as a whole benefits as well, right? So I'll flag it out to you later, but we still think it's important nonetheless. Let's continue, right? The next thing they told us is that, because the majority does not benefit, and that coincides with this POI, and that's why we should never help these minorities. No, we think that, there's always cases where you help the minorities, right? Are they then saying that you should never help minorities at all? That we should just leave them there to die, or that minorities don't deserve to have children? No, just because you are like numerically smaller proportion in the population doesn't mean that you don't deserve governmental protection. It means that all the more you deserve that kind of governmental protection. So we think that on-site opposition, there's a complete assertion on their side. And then the last thing they told us is about opportunity cost, right? Which is their entire second substantive, which is, the whole idea that, governments are, no thank you, not going to have enough money to kind of fund these programs, or that, governments will divert resources from other programs in order to fund these fertility treatments. Now, a few responses, right? Firstly, we think that if these things are important enough, governments will always find enough money to fund it, right? That's why we prioritize, for instance, defense spending, no thank you, and that's why, we are able to devote such a huge amount of money to defense spending, right? Because there's a clear reflection of the government's priorities in this area. But more importantly, we think that on the second level, right, even if you don't benefit the majority, you still have to protect the rights. Like government money, government funds are for the sole purpose of carrying out these governmental duties, right? So the lack of funds is never an excuse for a government to shirk their responsibility to people, and never an excuse for them to, not want to take action. So we don't think that this applies. Lastly, we think that, ultimately, if you're going to raise taxes, we're fine with that, right? Because we recognize that these rights are more important, no thank you, and these rights are able to, on the whole, benefit people. Second point of contention on, which side better solves the problem. Now, the first thing that's a contention here, right, is what is even the problem? Because on their side, they say that the problem is that, people are not willing to have kids, and that's why there's a low population growth. Well, we think that in either case, people are still not going to have kids anyway, so it's not like that problem doesn't exist on that side as well, right? We think comparatively, we address it better, because at least we reduce the kind of financial burden it takes for you to conceive a child. And we think that, no thank you, that is fundamentally important, and that's a part of the decision-making calculus of people who want their children in the first place, right? But secondly, we think that this debate revolves around people who don't have children, because the motion presumes that you're talking about people who want to even go for these fertility treatments in the first place. That is a natural assumption of the motion, and we think that they're not debating the spirit of the motion, right? But fundamentally, we think that, when we're talking about these kinds of people who want to have children but cannot have children, we think that ultimately, even if after they are able to have children, you increase the population count anyway. So on the comparative, we think that proposition still increases the population count better than anything the opposition can ever talk about. Let's move on to my substantive now, right? On the whole idea of, no thank you sir, of empowering the government, how we empower the government, right, to make better decisions for the state. The idea here is that governments must always be able to cater their kind of population policies in order to cater it to the kind of economic policies or the other political policies that they want to enact in the society today. Right? We think that ultimately, because these population policies create the core demographic of people that exist within society, and because, no thank you madam, because the governments always plan for the long run and must always take into consideration, what is the demographic of the country will look like in like maybe 10, 20 years down the road, right? I think that governments have a natural incentive to look at these kinds of areas, right? This is something that the groundwork has been laid on by my first speaker in his second tier of his first substantive, but I'm going to extend it further on how this helps to enact concrete benefits to the government in terms of their governance of the country, right? The point here, okay, sure.
If you are biologically capable of having children, why do you even need to pursue fertility treatment in the first place?
Okay, two things. Firstly, if I'm biologically, just because I don't want to have children, doesn't mean that I cannot, right? It doesn't mean that I can, right? Because, right, we think that there's a whole demographic of people who could opt for IVF, but because they don't want to put the kind of financial burden on themselves, that's why they don't opt for it, right? So there's still the demographic of people who, our policy will change the decision-making calculus off because we make it easier for them to go for IVF and therefore they want to. But secondly, even if we accept that the people who biologically can have children but don't want to have children exist, we think that on either side, you're not going to help them anyway. So we don't think that your side solves the problem any better. And moreover, we just think that, ultimately things like baby bonuses and incentives for them to have children still exist on either side. They're obviously not mutually exclusive, so we don't see how this is a problem in today's debate. Let's go back to my substantive, right? On the whole idea of how, the state, no thank you, can have better governance. We see cases, right, for instance, of, in Singapore where you have things like the aging population, places like Japan where you have the aging population, and you see that, as people grow older, the kind of workforce is going to be diminished, right? The kind of workforce that, numerically is going to have lesser people, and that's why they're going to have greater burdens in order to care for the elderly. And we ultimately think that these people are kind of taxpayers, these people are people who contribute to the government's ability to subsidize the living of those people who are older as well, right? So naturally, everybody will be affected by population policies that the government implements, even if they're not directly affected and directly impacted by those kind of policies. But more importantly, we also think that this affects the economic growth and efficiency of the country, right? Because a lot of economic models price large labor pools and like cheap labor pools, things like that, right? We think like, for instance, that a lot of economic activity, for instance in Singapore, rely on trying to increase the kind of population that you have within the country in order to increase your economic growth. So we think that at the point at which these kinds of population policies can help to bolster the workforce and can help to reduce the burden on that workforce and care for the elderly, everybody in society benefits and everybody in society reaps the trickle-down effects of these economic growth, of these economic developments, right? And that is why we think that even if you're not directly impacted by the government's ability to implement these policies, you're still indirectly reaping the benefits, and that's why the government needs to do these kinds of things, and that's why the government's decisions here are justified. For all these reasons, right, ladies and gentlemen, because we help to empower the individual, but we help to benefit the larger majority as well, please stand and recite proposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 11 seconds. I thank the speaker for her speech. Next, may I invite the second speaker of the opposition to deliver his speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, the biggest problem with proposition was that they assumed that fertility treatment is a magical psychological tool that suddenly makes people want to have children because all the factors like stress, the lack of time, and the massive costs which are inherently involved in raising a child suddenly disappear. Unfortunately, the reality of the world is this, that these factors all still exist, and this is the reason why there are low birth rates, because people don't want to have children in the first place. Proposition's entire case has been built upon this incredibly flimsy assumption, only representing the minuscule minority of society of roughly 4%, while claiming to benefit everyone in society. We're going to deal with everything that they've told us in two very simple points of contention. First, what exactly is the duty of the government? And second, what are the larger ramifications on society as a whole? So first, on the duty of the government, and here's where you heard their first speaker substantive, which is diametrically opposed to what we brought to you in our first speaker, where they told us about protecting individual rights and about achieving some kind of societal good. We already argued that fertility in and of itself may be desirable for a certain category of people, but reproduction in and of itself is not something which is essential to making your life something which you can live. And we proved this to you in our first speaker. Therefore, we proved that as a result of this, it doesn't justify us taking funds away from more important things in the status quo, such as healthcare and education, which directly uplift people now. But proposition then retreated to tell us about a very philosophical notion of how people are meant to reproduce and things like that. Well, we argue that that may be an interesting evolutionary perspective, but unfortunately that's not the duty of the government, which is merely meant to protect people and organize them in an efficient manner to advance societies forward. No, thank you. And here's where the biggest problem with their side. That they told us they were not standing for minorities entirely. We disagree. There are a couple of reasons why we don't stand by this. First, the majority of those who are opting for fertility treatments in the first place are those who are in, for instance, the category of 35 to 40-year-old people. And this means that unfortunately these are people who chose consciously to delay having children in the first place. No thank you. This already means that since they're in that late age category, it's highly unlikely that IVF is going to work. And that is why, for instance, the rates of fertility treatment working for those in the age category has been on the decline. Clearly, proposition hasn't been listening to what we told you in our first speaker. But the second thing which they accused us of was about entrenching inequality. This in and of itself isn't true. Let's give you another response in addition to what my first speaker told you. The reason why inequality becomes worse on their side is because if you're going to have full funding for fertility treatment, the people who are going to be taken up the most are likely to be the poor people. And this is because of the difference in terms of how they view children entirely. Poor people tend to view children as economic assets who can guarantee their lives in the future. No thank you. And unfortunately, that is why in most of the developing world, they have families which are very large in number because they view children as the key to protect them in the future as well. Therefore, by their policy, there are going to be a far greater number of poor children whom these families simply can't support at all. And considering they're already taking away money from all the essential things like education and healthcare, they really can't stand for bettering inequality at all. No. The second point of contention, therefore, is about the impact on society. And here's where we heard their second speaker substantive on somehow empowering the government. Now, they told us that the workforce will be diminished, etc. if we don't have this policy. Now, this entire argument was hung on the assumption that fertility treatment is a massive population policy. But clearly that isn't the case for a number of reasons. First, it affects a very small group of people within society. No thank you. Even for these category of people, whether it's effective or not is already questionable, as seen from the low effectiveness rates. But secondly, and more importantly, we also proved to you that in and of itself, fertility treatment is not something which is going to be affecting the rest of society in terms of tackling the many other factors which exist for why people in general don't have children. Therefore, on that analysis as well, we take this to today's debate. But the next issue under this was about the opportunity cost. No thank you. Which they really can't ignore on proposition. Why is this the case? We recognize that we live in a world, especially in the developed world, where funds are increasingly finite and governments have to spend on a variety of things and prioritize many different aspects of decisions in terms of what they spend on. No thank you. Therefore, in that context, we need to make sure that we spend our resources efficiently to benefit as many people as possible, rather than just a very small minority of society. Proposition hasn't dealt with this argument, and we've proven to you that in their model where they're going to be supporting full funding for every kind of fertility treatment, such as, for instance, your IVF, which costs $10,000 for a single cycle, for instance, surrogacy, which costs hundreds of thousands for each child which you wish to have. These are massive costs which governments simply cannot afford. Therefore, with the argument of opportunity cost still standing, no thank you, opposition is still standing strong in today's debate. I'm moving on to my first point of constructive, which is going to be on uplifting orphans. No. The thesis of my argument is that this changes the calculus of couples that want children. In the status quo, couples don't really consider adoption as the first choice because they prefer to have a child that is of their own flesh and blood. However, the alternatives to natural conception are expensive in the status quo, such as IVF and surrogacy, which is what makes couples turn to adoption as the most viable alternative now. This is why adoption rates are currently increasing across the developed world, where IVF remains expensive. Hold on a moment, with over 23,000 adoptions in the US in 2013. Why is this bad?
So we've already told you how people who want children through IVF are not going to adopt anyway because they are not genetically related to their kid. They want a kid that is their own.
Well, unfortunately for you, there is a diversity of people who want children. Some of them just want the child because it makes them happy. Others are a really small category of people who really want it to be of their own flesh and blood. I'm going to be explaining this in the substantive. This is something which is good for orphans because it uplifts them from the conditions which occur within orphanages. We need to understand that most orphanages are run entirely on donations, and thus, given this very limited supply of funds, the conditions in orphanages are terrible. They are conditions where, for instance, 20 children are squeezed into a tiny room, where you're unable to provide them with nutritious food, and you can't give any of them an education, which is what will be able to uplift them in the future. Adoption, therefore, enables these children to step out of this into a better world. No thank you. One that is no longer denied to them by the very arbitrary circumstances of their birth. And opposition is incredibly proud to stand by this. Funding IVF treatment and other fertility treatments by the government makes it far more accessible, and thus it becomes the default option for all childless couples, and they no longer consider adoption as a viable alternative. This means essentially that the government is now essentially backing IVF and other fertility treatments as a good choice because it chooses to fund it. And this means that the bulk of people who were previously unsure of what kind of option they want to take are now swayed by what seems to be a government mandate. This completely undoes the entire trend of normalization of adoption that we've been trying so hard to push for, led by stars like Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. And therefore, fewer adoptions will become the prevalent norm. This is terrible because it means that orphans are going to be trapped in this endless cycle that we could have instead prevented. Therefore, we uplift orphans on opposition. The second argument that we have is on incentivizing medical reform and development in fertility treatment. No. We have to understand that companies are profit motivated. When they don't make enough profit, they incentivize themselves to make it cheaper and more accessible for those who are dead set on IVF and other fertility treatments. It's about really simple math. So for instance, you have 5 people who want to take up IVF at the cost of $10,000, but when you decrease the cost to, for instance, $7,500, you have 10 people taking it up. And this profit motivation is what incentivizes companies to conduct research and development to see how it can be made cheaper. And this is exactly how India solved polio, because when people didn't take it up because injection delivery was too expensive, companies were forced to change it to oral delivery, which made it cheaper and more accessible to the masses. And this is how India solved polio. The key distinction between this and Proposition's policy is that this is private incentive, which is not just about cost, but also about the method of IVF and other fertility treatments, making it safer and possibly more effective in the future as well. And that is what will benefit society on the whole. Given currently that IVF is not 100% successful, especially for the category of people who are currently taking it up, further research into it is necessary and beneficial for the community of couples dead set on IVF. Therefore, because fertility doesn't achieve a more fertile land for all, we are incredibly proud to stand in opposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 9 seconds. I thank the speaker for his speech. Next, may I invite the third speaker of the proposition to deliver her speech.
Gentlemen, today side opposition has come up and they said a lot of things, but essentially, right, what they're saying is that they do not care about these minorities and they do not want to do anything to ensure that these minorities actually get an equal treatment as to the rest of the population. And we tell you today, right, that this is not what we can allow in society, because we as a society and as the government of the society needs to ensure that every single individual is given an equal opportunity and equal access to the things that they need in life. So first, moving on to my points of contention, right? 2 main issues here. Firstly, on which side best empowers the individual, and secondly, on what the goals of the government actually are. So firstly, on which side empowers the individual. Now, the opposition has come up, they constantly told us, right, about how our policies are going to help at all, because, these individuals don't actually want to conceive, and, there are a lot of other factors that are affecting the birth rates, right? We tell you, yes, there are other factors that are affecting the birth rates, we acknowledge that, but we also acknowledge that there are these people who want to have children, who want to conceive, but are unable to do so simply because their genetics and the way that they were born does not allow for them to actually conceive. No, thank you, sir. And we tell you, right, that we are at least acknowledging the presence of these individuals who need our help and the support of the government, right? And we tell you that what we are doing today is at least ensuring that these individuals who are so disadvantaged have the choice, ladies and gentlemen. We tell you that the opposition today is not allowing them to have this choice, which we think is so imperative. And this is well about the second speaker's case, right? About the whole orphanage issue. Now they came out, they said that because they empower orphans because they allow these people to adopt orphans more easily, right? Now we tell you, right, that the choice to have a child is very different as to whether you want to adopt an orphan or have it through your own genetics and your own DNA, right? And we think that there are a lot of parents who want to have their own child born out of their own DNA because it's easier to feel a sense of attachment to this child, knowing that he is yours, he is your blood, he is your flesh, right? And we think that we want parents who feel this way to have the choice to choose to have children out of these fertilization treatments, right? And we tell you that adopting an orphan isn't going to bring about the same effect and isn't going to be the same for all these parents. But furthermore, right, we are not saying that these people are going to be unable to adopt orphans anymore, right? Their case is not mutually exclusive to their side because we are still allowing for orphanages to be around, and they can encourage couples to adopt orphans if we want to, right? But in some cases, we tell you, right, that in some cases, these treatments will fail. Like IVF, it's not always 100% success rate, right? And we tell you that in such cases, right, there will still be people who choose to adopt orphans instead of going through such treatments, right? And we tell you, right, that if their orphanages are in such poor condition, then we are perfectly fine with subsidizing it and allocating funds into ensuring that these orphans actually get a basic good standard of living and quality of life, right? We don't think that that's such an issue that we cannot deal with. And if the problem is the conditions that they live in, then we're perfectly fine with improving it. But furthermore, right, by their calculus, no thank you sir, they think and they constantly say, right, that benefiting the minority doesn't matter. So if benefiting the minority does not matter, then why are they so focused and so intent on actually benefiting these orphans and ensuring that these orphans get adopted? Because after all, ladies and gentlemen, these orphans are a minority in society today. And we tell you that, by their calculus, we shouldn't be, caring about their substantive as well. But we do, ladies and gentlemen, because we tell you that we care about the minorities and we will ensure that these orphans actually get a basic standard of living, and that's how we like to address issues in society today. But moving on to the second idea, right, that of a financial burden that you brought up, and constantly said that these parents who do not have money for these artificial means of fertilization will not have money to raise their child. Firstly, we ask you, what about those who can't afford these fertilizing treatment but can, actually conceive naturally, right? Who do not need to pay such exorbitant funds, right? Who are actually fertile. We don't think that it's fair that we allow these people who may be equally poor to have children, and these people who are not fertile enough to not have children, right? And we think that what we are doing today is leveling the playing field, right? And ensuring that those who want to have children can have children, regardless of whether they have funds or not. But furthermore, we tell you that if we fund these fertility treatments for these people, then we are at least lessening the financial burden on these, infertile couples, right? Because we tell you that if these couples want children so badly, then they are going to save up and they're going to find the money either way, right? But this is going to be even worse because on the comparative on their side, right, when these couples actually save up more money, then there's an increased financial burden on them, and they're not able to have as much funds as they have to raise their child to the best extent, which we on the side proposition are allowing them to do so, right? And we tell you that they are going to bring out even worse effects. But moving on to the other idea, on that of corporations and how they motivate corporations to innovate and everything, we tell you that firstly, this actually isn't going to cause companies to want to actually innovate, because the price that they put for this treatment, right, is not because they want to hike up the price. It's because that's how much the treatment actually costs and the technology and how much it costs. But we tell you that furthermore, the success rate of these treatments is not affected by the innovation and everything. It's so even just allowing them more competition isn't going to cause them to actually improve the process anymore. But moving on to my second main point of contention, right, on what the goals of the government are. Now, we tell you, right, that the government is there to look after the population and to look after the majority, yes, we admit that. But that does not mean that the government ignores the minority as well, especially in such cases where there is such a glaring minority who is facing such serious burdens and such serious difficulties because, of something as unfair as simply being born infertile, something as unfair as the birth lottery, ladies and gentlemen. And before I move on, yes sir.
Given the context of cash-strapped economies around the developed world, where does the massive amount of funding needed for all your programs suddenly come from?
Well, we don't think that we are going to actually need to, we don't think that, this funding is going to be so much, because, well, they said, right, that, very little people are going to be affected by this, and then they said that it's going to be a very high cost. So we don't understand how they can actually argue that we are going to cost a lot if they also want to argue that we're only benefiting a minority. So either way, right, we are benefiting the majority, or if not, then we are not going to take a lot of funds, which either way works for the side of the proposition. So moving back to my case, right, on why it's so unfair to actually not fund these minority groups. Now we tell you, right, why having children is so integral, right? Because as a parent, you will want to let your legacy, your family traditions be passed down for generations, right? But further than that, we tell you what children can bring to parents, right? They can support you, they can work for you, and they can ensure that in your retirement age, you have a good life, you have a good quality of life, right? And this is why having children is so important. And the opposition here does not seem willing to acknowledge that. In fact, they seem to be constantly denying the fact that these children are actually of grave importance and play a very integral role and integral part in the lives of couples, right? And we do not think that we should underplay the role of these children, and we should simply restrict these parents from having the rights to have children if they want to have children in the first place, right? But furthermore, we tell you that we are also benefiting society on a larger scale. Why? As my previous speakers have already come up to tell you, because we are allowing the government to balance the demographics in society, ensure that we do not have an aging population so that our country is able to sustain itself in the long run and actually grow economically as well, and ensure a stable economy because of the workforce that we are able to produce, right? And we think that on this hill, right, while individuals may not be able to see this benefit because it's not a very immediate or a very visible benefit, right, it is still a benefit that's ultimately going to ensure the greater good of society. And in this way, right, the government is ensuring that the majority of people and that society as a whole is also benefiting. But furthermore, we tell you that government funding is not a zero-sum game, because we are still going to fund rights such as healthcare, we're still going to fund rights such as education. So it's not right for the opposition to come up and tell us that we are foregoing all these things. But what we are saying is that it's imperative that we also place emphasis on these minority groups who are losing out so much, such an integral part of their lives, right? Because we think it's very important. And that's because of that, right, we tell you that we are fulfilling the government goals of solving inequity and promoting social equality, ladies and gentlemen, while ensuring that the rights of these individuals are protected and they do have the choice to have children if they want to.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 18 seconds. I thank the speaker for her speech. Next, may I invite the third speaker of the opposition to deliver her speech.
Question that proposition could never answer was, where is the money going to come from? And that was the simple logic which they never once responded to, only telling us in third speaker that it's not a lot. Even though within their first speaker they already told us, number one, it's full funding. Number two, they didn't have any restrictions on the number of times a particular individual could go for IVF, which means they can go for things like 8 cycles of IVF, cost 10,000 each time. 8 times 10 is 80,000 for these particular individuals. And that itself is a huge strain on the government, because it's not just one individual, it's even then a minority of individuals who will still affect the economy because of that large sum per particular individual. This was something they never understood. But then on their side, they also assumed that proposition somehow had to throw them a policy that solved the problem. We're fine with status quo, that status quo is good enough to help individuals by making the option already accessible to them. So with that frame in mind, let's examine today's debate in 2 main points of contention. Firstly, on what's best for the country, and secondly, what's best for the people. Now let's move on to the first point, on what's best for the country. Under this was their first speaker's full substantive on why governments have a duty, essentially telling us that reproduction is a fundamental right to each and every individual. On the first layer of analysis, my first two speakers already told you why that's simply not true. There are couples who don't have children and can lead equally perfect, happy lives. But we're going to tell you that on an even if layer, even if it was a fundamental right, there are always a hierarchy of rights which government prioritize anyways, which means governments have to balance the rights between these individuals who are seeking to go for fertility treatment compared to the individuals who need essential things like education, essential things like healthcare. It means that they make the option available, but it doesn't mean they give full funding to it because they acknowledge that they have to balance the rights of each and every single individual within society. We don't prioritize a particular group over another group, but rather we balance the rights of each and every single individual. But more than that, going by proposition's logic, they would fully fund essentially everything within society, no matter how small the request may be. Even things like cosmetic surgery, things like private education, all these sorts of small things will be funded by proposition because they believe it was a fundamental right to self-actualize when you listen to their own speaker's logic. But that's really not true. It's always about a balance of rights within society. Now let's move on, no thank you madam, to the second idea, which was our first speaker's second substantive on opportunity cost. Firstly, they just told us that we always find the money, but they never told us about this vague resource that they were going to tell us from. But we're going to tell you that in cases like countries like Greece, where they're already having austerity measures, this is going to be particularly harmful to these countries when you essentially force them to give these sorts of individuals who want IVF even more money. We're going to tell you that secondly, it's even worse for these countries because you essentially cut off funding from institutions like the IMF who are continuing to give these sorts of countries with austerity measures the funding because what happens is that you don't fulfill their conditions anymore. So it's even worse for the funding of countries who are already essentially in austerity. So which is why it's even worse. But then within the third speaker, they told us that it's extremely important because the parents need to use this money to raise their children in later when they grow older. Going by their own logic, they would essentially subsidize anything within society, even things like hospital bills, because C-sections are arguably also extremely expensive. Proposition would subsidize it because they claim that this takes away money from raising children in the future. But that's really not true because governments always have to do what's best for people, even if it means we have to balance some of these rights. Now let's move on to the next idea. No thank you. Yes, madam.
Madam, we're perfectly fine with funding C-sections because we think that governments should always fund things that will benefit them in the future as well. They cannot neglect the future for the now.
Madam, by your logic, you would also similarly fund things like cosmetic surgery. You would also similarly fund things like all these sorts of frivolous things which individuals want to pursue. But that's really not what happens within society. It's always about balancing the rights of an individual or a minority group versus the rest of society to do what's best for these individuals. Next on the next idea on our first substantive and how it's principally justified. Here was where we gave to you the logic that this essentially affects everyone within society. And here they simply told us that we must always aim to protect minorities within society. Yes, we agreed that we have to essentially protect these individuals within society, which is why we already give them other options, things like adoption, which means that they still can have children. But the difference is we don't allow them to prioritize a particular type of child that they want within society. That means on proposition, just because parents want a particular type of child, they will allow for things like genetic modification when the child is young. They will allow things for like gender testing on propositions like going by their own logic. But that's really not true. We already grant you the right to have children. We're simply telling you that you cannot prioritize a particular type of child that you want over others. And next on the next idea, which was on radical reforms for research and development, was an idea completely dropped by proposition. They never responded to how this actually results in lower costs for individuals who want to seek it from private institutions. On the second big point on what's best for the people. Under this was their first speaker's second substantive on benefits to stakeholders, about how you can pursue it at a younger age, how it helps you self-actualize, and how it also helps social inequality. But that's really not true. My first two speakers already told you why it only affects a minority of individuals, which is why they essentially had a causation correlation fallacy. But I'm going to be furthering this logic, on the second layer of analysis, we're going to prove to you why the outcome isn't actually concrete, which means all the benefits that they talked about may never even come about, which means we're putting all our money into an outcome that is uncertain, because IVF follows an extremely small window, from the times when you are 30 to 35. But on proposition, they allow anyone to go for IVF, even individuals who have surpassed that age, who are 50 years old, 60 years old, they would allow for these kinds of individuals to still go for IVF, which means that it's not, the benefits won't actually accrue, and we're simply putting our money into something which may never ever come about. No thank you, madam. On the second idea, on their second speaker's first substantive on empowering governments, because they essentially had a larger population. Let's just very quickly point out that this substantive was essentially telling us why children are good. Yes, children are great, but it doesn't mean that we particularly have to put all our money into these sorts of particular way. So which is why we already told you that firstly, it only attacks an extremely small minority of people, and secondly, we're putting all our money into a particular outcome that is extremely uncertain, which is why we simply cannot have that. On the last idea, on uplifting orphans, here the only response we heard is that, oh, it's okay, firstly, it's not mutually exclusive, and secondly, we want people, these parents want their children who are genetically identical to them. Firstly, what proposition is doing is that they're essentially condemning and promoting a sort of social narrative that only promotes one sort of particular type of child, which is that you have to be genetically identical to your parent, if not, because of the fact that they are actively supporting funding towards these sorts of things. We're going to tell you that on the second level, my second speaker already told you why it essentially changes the calculus of individuals to acknowledge that adoption is actually a viable alternative, because you no longer prioritize a particular type of child with a particular genetic makeup over other individuals, which is why our side is fundamentally better. What proposition does essentially is that they have contradicting stances which totally undercuts the narrative and the normalization of adoption, because governments essentially support only one type of child by having funding towards that. Therefore, because fertility didn't make the country any more fertile, I am proud to stand on opposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 15 seconds. I thank the speaker for her speech. May I now invite the opposition to deliver their reply speech?
Ladies and gentlemen, it is extremely naive and impractical to assume that money can somehow grow on trees and that all fertility treatments can be funded on the cheap. Because given the demographics of those who actually choose to go for fertility treatments, and therefore the ineffectiveness of them, propositions policy basically allowed people to go over and over again regardless of whether they were successful or not. And as we proved throughout, with each cycle costing anywhere between $10,000 to hundreds of thousands of dollars for all kinds of fertility treatments, this policy in and of itself was economically disastrous because there simply wasn't enough money. And given the context of crisis-stricken countries across the developed world, proposition really had no case. We're going to deal with everything they've told us in two very simple points of clash. First, what exactly is the government duty of care? And second, what is the actual impact on society? So first, the government duty of care. And here's where we recognize in opposition what exactly a government is supposed to do in society. That a government is something which is supposed to protect the most important needs given the finite amount of resources that we have within society. And therefore, within that context, it was about prioritizing what was the most important, what could bring about the most amount of benefit with the least amount of resources. And given that context, we established very clearly from the start that allowing someone who wasn't able to conceive to go and attain fertility treatment for absolutely no cost at all simply wasn't a priority because it didn't bring about any concrete benefit to society at all. And the only thing which proposition could tell us was that, oh, this was some kind of population policy. But throughout our case, we had a series of responses. The first thing that we told you was that no, this really isn't, because it only concerns a very small minority within your societies, and therefore the impact, if any at all, would be way too small to have any kind of bigger, larger ramifications on your country's demographics entirely. That was our first response. But we moved on. Second, we told you that this in and of itself was not really effective because of the type of fertility treatments and the demographics of those who choose to go for it. Our third response was that there are numerous other factors for why population birth rates are so low. And this is something which was never responded responded to by proposition, where we gave you concrete reasons for why in actuality, there are many other real-life factors that determine why people don't want to have children in the first place. And therefore, offering a small group of people fertility treatment wouldn't suddenly change these population demographics. But even if we consider to all of that, opposition essentially proved that even if this was a population policy, it was a terrible one. And that was why I moved on to the second point of contention, or what was the impact on society. And this is the main grounds of opposition's case, because we proved to you that from the start, we were not trying to offer a solution to low birth rates. All we sought to do was to prove that proposition's policy of free fertility treatment for everyone all the time would only make the situation a lot worse. And that's why our first argument came on the opportunity cost, and why having these kinds of fertility treatments provided for free to everyone means that you have to divert resources from many more important things, like primary and secondary education, from healthcare, basic sustainable healthcare for everyone in our society, from the construction of basic infrastructure. What this essentially meant was that to benefit a very small minority of people for something which they were not even sure of, proposition essentially disregarded the majority of society in many other more pressing areas, and that was something that opposition couldn't accept. The second thing which we told you about was really important as well, which was about orphans in society, and why on our side we actually incentivized people to adopt even more. What happened on proposition was that essentially when they had the government sponsoring full fertility treatment, they essentially changed the calculus of every couple who was childless, making them go for fertility treatment instead of actually considering adoption in the first place. And we proved systematically why that was bad for orphans across the developed world, in terms of them having to stay in the really poor conditions that we simply cannot solve again because governments lack the necessary resources to do so. The last thing that we told you was about medical research and development, and why there's absolutely no incentive for research and development when governments are going to go and fund your fertility treatment completely. On the comparative, when we had it not funded, what we enabled companies to do was to go and research on these things themselves and make it better for society. Therefore, on opposition, we stood by one thing, that fertility treatment for all was not something which made our land fertile.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 16 seconds. I thank the speaker for his speech. Finally, to conclude the debate as a whole, may I invite the proposition reply speaker to deliver the reply speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we see an opposition that doesn't want to engage us on the spirit of the motion, right? On the natural presumption that we're talking about people who want to have children but cannot have them and cannot afford IVF. We think that the crux of the debate lies in this demographic that they've been completely unwilling to talk about here today, right? And more importantly, they've continued to assert to us many assertions, right? Things like how we should never help the minorities, things like how the minorities or poor people shouldn't have children because, you know, the children are going to end up poor anyway. We think that the kind of lines of argumentation coming from opposition are completely heinous and completely unjustified, and we completely cannot stand for it. We think that today they've ignored our, aside from ignoring the demographic that we're talking about, right, they've completely ignored our second speaker substantive as well, about how, you know, the majority still benefits from these kinds of policies through the trickle-down effects of, you know, benefiting economic growth, right? And we think that ultimately we're going to show to you that even when they did reply to us, they're still going to lose on two grounds. Firstly, on the idea of governmental prioritization and governmental duties, and secondly, on, you know, doing what is best for society as a whole. So let's look at the first issue on what government should do, right? Because they essentially only had two lines of logic here. On their side, they told us that governments should always do things that is the best interest of majorities and hence should neglect minority interests. And secondly, they talked to us about opportunity costs. We have a number of responses on side proposition, right? When they talked about how we should always support the majority only, we talked to you about four responses. Firstly, about how, you know, just because you want to benefit the majority, it doesn't mean that you want to neglect the minority. I think that minority rights are still incredibly important, and that, you know, governmental prioritization should never be solely based on the numerical number of people that you affect. Secondly, even if we accept that, you know, that these minority rights are not as important, we still think that fundamentally governments have to protect the fundamental rights of everybody in society, and we think that ultimately governments have to protect the equal interest of the equal access of these rights to everybody in society, right? And this is why we think that, you know, ultimately reproductive rights are something that fall under governmental domain. Thirdly, we've talked to you about how we still benefit the majority through economic trickle-down effects and things like that. That's in my substantive that they never actually dealt with and they've never rebutted, right? So we think that there's a fundamental concession to our point about how the majority of people still benefit from these policies indirectly. Then fourthly, we talk to you about the kind of tension that is in their case, right? When they come up to us on one hand and talk to us about how the minorities should never be prioritized, but on the other hand, tell us that we have to benefit the orphans and that we have to take into account the interests of the orphans. We think that their entire substantive about orphans is a fundamental concession that you can sometimes benefit the minorities, and that's precisely the reason why we have to enact these policies. Second idea on the opportunity cost, right? Again, a number of responses. First thing we told you is that funding should never be based on whether or not governmental policy should never be based on whether funding is available, right? We think that fundamentally funding can always be made available if it's important enough. But secondly, we talked to you about how governmental funding is a reflection of their interests and reflection of their priorities, right? If they price it enough for them to want to enact that policy, we don't see how funding is a fundamental problem. Second idea of what's best for society. The only thing they talk to us here is about how they are not offering a solution in today's debate because it's not their owners and they just want to maintain status quo. No, that's not true, right? Because fundamentally they've really considered that having a larger population is an important thing and it's something that we should strive towards. And if they want to benefit the majority, then we think that on comparative, proposition side still benefits everybody in this debate on a much greater scale, right? So we think that there's a fundamental evasion of their burden, but we think that ultimately they still lose, right? And lastly, they talk to us about how how targeting these people who want to go for IVF is not the root problem of low population growth, right? We think that fundamentally, if you're going to talk about people who don't want to have children, you're not going to change their decision-making calculus anyway. So that's not mutually exclusive. But more importantly, we think that fundamentally we increase their rate of effectiveness and we help empower these people to make the choices that they want to make. And for all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to propose.